Is Roman Reigns an all-time great? Well, we're going to find out in this video. Welcome back to the review space, and I do want to discuss this now that Roman Reigns has returned, at least to officially announce his, remission from his health issues. Definitely a good, good news, good sign that he's a little bit healthier. He's not. It's not bad news, and so it's a good thing that Roman Reigns came back, got a good pop from the crowd, and I want to discuss basically this topic of, is Roman Reigns one of the greatest of all time, one of the greatest WWE superstars, one of the greatest professional wrestlers and wrestling superstars ever in the history of this business? Is he an all-time great? I mean, is Roman Reigns really somebody that you consider as an all-time one of the greatest, most incredible, phenomenal wrestlers of all time? It's interesting because, Roman has been pushed like crazy since 2014. Ever since they broke up, and ever since the Shield broke up, and so he became a single star. Back then, it's going to be about maybe a little over 4.5 years ago, not quite 5 years ago, because I think by this point, 5 years ago, around March 2014, the Shield was still a thing. But they would end up splitting up a little bit later that year, and then Roman would get that huge mega push as a singles competitor and go compete for the WWE title, the World Heavyweight title, and the Universal Championship when that was introduced. And so, Roman is definitely somebody that they tried, that Vince McMahon saw a lot of potential in, somebody that could be his next top star. I think even going as far back as during the Shield era. I mean, even as far back as when he was in, I think it was FCW at the time, and then he was chosen or handpicked when they were creating that Shield faction. And CM Punk suggesting the whole thing where I want 3 different people. And he ended up wanting to pick, I think it was at the time, it was Cassius Ohno, Chris Hero, and John. I was going to say John Moxley, Dean Ambrose, and Seth Rollins. And he wanted that trio, 3 new guys from developmental to basically be either feud with him or align with him, something like that. And then that ultimately ended up changing into the Shield faction, and it became Roman Reigns as the big guy, the guy with the biggest muscles and all that. He's the one with the size, the bruiser type, the muscle of the group. And then you have, of course, Dean Ambrose and Seth Rollins, who are also really talented from the indies. So, I think going as far back as the Shield days, when he was handpicked to be, this kind of good-looking, potential top star, could be the next big thing. I mean, they protected him. He was protected, I think, right from the beginning, and he was made to look good. He was able to learn traveling on the road with the rest of the other guys, Seth Rollins and Dean, and he became friends with them. And so it's pretty cool to see that dramatic change from just the early days. I remember when the Shield first debuted back in late 2012. I can't believe that was well over 6 years ago. And even Tyler Black, Seth Rollins, when he was signed, that goes back 2010. He was ROH champion at the time in early mid 2010, and then he ultimately got a quick rushed call from WWE, yeah, you gotta be here, ASAP, and then he was in developmental for over 2 years. Roman Reigns, I don't remember exactly when he first arrived at FCW. It's probably maybe around the same time as those guys, as Dean Ambrose and 2010 developmental territories. 2010 to 2012, around the same time as Dean Ambrose and Seth Rollins. But anyway, it seemed it always felt like he's been handpicked by WWE as somebody that could be the next top star. He had a good look, kind of a chiseled look to him, a big jawline. That jawline is just really, he's got that alpha male look, that intense, very rough-looking kind of guy, but he's handsome. So he's got the bearded look, the long hair, and everything. Big physique, football player physique. And he's got the bloodline. He's got that wrestling multi-generation legacy to his family. He's a part of the, I guess, the Anoa'i family. which is tied to the Rocks family and all that. So that big Samoan family in wrestling is very, very prominent and very powerful. They have a big influence in professional wrestling. So anyway, and it's crazy too because I didn't know that he was the younger brother of Rosie. Like that tripped me out. I was like, holy smoke! Like damn! Like he's the younger bro of Rosie. Like that big fat dude that would like dress up as a wannabe superhero during like the Ruthless Aggression era in the early mid 2000s. Like that comedy duo with him and the Hurricane. Like he was he's the younger brother. You know what I mean? And they're so many years apart. Like I think Rosie was born in like maybe the early 1970s, and Roman Reigns was born in like the mid 1980s. I think what year was he born? 1985. May 25th, 1985 was when he was born. So there you go. Yeah, I mean he's a millennial. You know, he's part of my generation or Generation Y, kids that were born in the mid late 80s. Who basically grew up in the 1990s generation. But his brother is a Gen Xer. Like he was born in like the early mid 70s or something like that. You know what I mean? So they're like years apart. It's crazy. They're like a generation apart. It's just fascinating. Like by the time that Roman Reigns became a wrestler, started going into wrestling, his brother was on his way out. You know what I mean? You know, going out of wrestling, like retiring or winding down from professional wrestling. So it's kind of fascinating to see the two separate generations and like their brothers. It's like that's really weird. But anyway, Roman is handpicked, I think, right from the get-go, like right pretty much from the beginning, since like during the Shield days, that this guy could be somebody. That good look. He was pretty good in the ring, like a very athletic guy, although he had a very limited moveset. And he didn't have a lot of like crazy, flashy moves. He wasn't a flashy guy, but he was a very basic, powerful guy. He had some really good like power moves. You know, he would slam his opponents, throw his opponents around. You know, he had slam moves. He had like a lot of hard hitting moves, like the spear and the Superman punch. They looked cool. You know what I mean? Even that little side apron kick that he would do back in the Shield days. And even that big flying dive that he would do, like the Undertaker dive. I remember he used to do that in the Shield. So he definitely was a very good in-ring performer. I think he still is a very good in-ring performer. So, I don't think Roman gets enough credit as an actual in-ring competitor, somebody who can pull off a good match, somebody that that has some good moves and actually look good in the ring and actually be convincing. I think the biggest drawback with Roman, though, obviously, is the mic skills. I mean, that's the biggest downfall of Roman, especially giving that horrible early 2015 like scripted promos that he would do, which is like 4 years ago, but everybody still remembers it. Back when Vince McMahon used to, write his promos, and he would give him suffering succotash and donkey donk for brains, and really, really horrible lines, and they sounded so bad, especially coming from his mouth. Like he was trying to cut comedy promos, almost like another version of John Cena, but he wasn't very convincing with it because his delivery was awful and the lines were awful. It's just not something that somebody that looked like him, this like really cool looking, almost like an anti-hero or a cool Samoan warrior barbarian looking guy. He looked like Khal Drogo from Game of Thrones. You know what I mean? And he's talking about like really crappy promos. He's talking about like horrible references and suffering succotash, and you got a donkey donk for brains, and he was trying to be funny, but it was like really corny lines. So that really, in my opinion, well, not in my opinion, as a matter of fact, that's what made the fans turn against him. That and the CM Punk thing. I remember when CM Punk did that Colt Cabana podcast. And you know how, like, these smart mark, indie nerds and all these geeks that follow CM Punk, they like to deride Punk. They like to kind of follow everything that he says, and they take everything that he says to heart. And he's got a pretty sizable, pretty big fan base, especially at that time. even when he wasn't wrestling anymore. And he cut that promo. He kind of buried Roman Reigns as like, oh, you got to make Roman look strong. You got to make Roman look strong. And he was basically, the way that he exposed Roman and his push, he threw him under the bus. He made him sound like a complete like loser. Like, oh, you got to make this guy look tough. You got to make this guy look good. Like, yeah, okay, well, I'll lose then. I'll voluntarily lose and make him look really strong. It was his way of making Roman sound like a jabroni. You know what I mean? He made Roman sound like he wasn't talented. Like he was somebody that was being forced down people's throats. And to be fair, I mean, in a lot of ways, Roman was. I mean, Roman was booked like incredibly, almost invincible against everybody, and they fed him so many different people. They fed him Braun Strowman, who had a really good momentum a couple of years ago, back in, I think it was like 2016, early 2017, when he had sort of like an undefeated streak going, and he was squashing guys, and he was doing really good. He was like he was dominating jobbers, and they were giving him squash matches, and he was having this momentum, and then he crashes right into Roman Reigns. I think it was it might have been at Fastlane or something like that. So Roman ended up, basically taking away that momentum, and so that fueled the fire even more. And even going all the way back to I think it was 2015 when Daniel Bryan wasn't a part of the Royal Rumble, I think. And they it was something like that. It was something like that where I remember they were booing the heck out of Roman Reigns by that point. I think because he ended up winning Rumble, I think at 2015 to face Lesnar for the title, and he failed at that too. He failed at Mania, interestingly enough, and Seth Rollins ended up cashing it in, and he was the one who had the longest WWE title reign, I think of 2015 if I'm not mistaken, until he got injured. But anyway, and then Roman ended up ultimately winning the title later that year, and then Sheamus cashed it in. Sheamus held it for a little bit, and then Roman finally got the title, and then he lost to Triple H in 2016. I think it was 2016 at the Rumble, and then Roman had the rematch against Triple H at WrestleMania. So there was this consistent, we're trying to make Roman, we're trying to get him over, we're trying to make him look good and look strong, and we're trying to make him the face of the company because, let's face it, Cena is on his way out. He's not as young as he used. He's obviously a lot older now, and he's been carrying the company since, 2005, 2006 as the top guy. And then you have Roman, they're trying to make this guy the next John Cena, and it just didn't work because you're giving him a bad position. You made him into a horrible character. Vince McMahon tried so desperately to make him be John Cena 2.0. And I think in a lot of ways that hindered Roman. I would imagine that if this was the Attitude Era in like the late 90s and we had a Roman Reigns, he would have been booked a lot better. He would have been given a more grittier booking, and they would have made him more Attitude Era-esque, made him allowed him to swear and cuss on the microphone and be a lot more anti-hero and just be a really cool character, somebody that you can easily root for instead of making him into a cheesy, cartoonish, and not cartoonish, but like a cheesy promo cutting like Joker kind of character where he's just cutting jokes and corny lines. Like you don't do that with somebody like Roman because he's different, or he should have been different from a John Cena. The long hair, the Samoan look, the tattoos, right? Very different look from John Cena. So he should have been booked differently. He should have came across more as a darker, edgier character. And if it was the Attitude Era, if this was 1999 instead of 2015, 2016, he would have been booked a lot better. He reminded me a little bit of Test, actually. We had a guy like that back in the late 90s. Test was kind of a similar guy. He's got, long hair, a beard, kind of a muscular physique. He, a handsome guy. He was like a blonde version of Roman Reigns. You know what I mean? He was a big guy, but he was kind of inexperienced. He wasn't much in the ring, but he had some solid moves and all that. He was capable enough. It's just that for some reason or another, Test didn't quite pan out. But back in 1999, there was a lot of potential with Test. They could have made Test into a big star. I remember, especially like during that summer of 1999, when they were having that little angle with it was Test and Stephanie McMahon, and he wanted to ask out Stephanie and go on a date with her and stuff like that. And that was kind of a cool thing. It almost seemed like they were trying to make a star. He could have been like a top guy, the next top guy. The girls were, women in the crowd were cheering for Test because he was a handsome dude, but he also had like that cool persona about him. He came across as a cool character, like a late '90s version of a Roman Reigns. But it's just, for some reason, I think Test just got buried. I think he got buried by Triple H when it came out that Trips and Stephanie were the ones that ended up getting married, and they became a couple ultimately in the end. And it felt like Test was just kind of sidelined after that, and then he just became a just another guy in the roster. So yeah, rest in peace, Test. By the way, I remember when he passed away back in the I think it was the late 2000s. And so you got somebody like Roman, who there's so much potential with Roman. Like, you could have done so much with him, and he could have been a really cool character. And in some ways, I mean, it's easy to cheer him now that he came back from a life-threatening illness, not just once but twice. He had it when he was young, in his early 20s, and that's the crazy part too, is that when Roman was younger, in his early 20s, and he had he had that disease. I think was it leukemia, right? And he had that, and then it went into remission and all that, and he became healthy, and then he ultimately ended up in WWE. All those years that went by, that people were booing him and really hating him, and they were anti-Roman and making fun of him and calling him names, and they were so venomously against Roman, and the crowd just completely booed him, and they disliked him. I mean, this was a guy who was already a cancer survivor, a guy who has his own personal health issues. Nobody knew about it, so Roman was shouldering all this stuff, and so it's easy to kind of look back and kind of feel sorry for him, but nobody felt sorry for him back then, because nobody knew. Nobody knew, you know what I mean? Nobody had an idea that this guy had health issues. So I don't know if people knew back then that this guy survived cancer, maybe, but then again, he kept it a secret for many, many years. I don't think he told anybody. Nobody knew. So it was almost like, I don't know if he enjoyed keeping it a secret from people. It was almost like his own burden to bear. He didn't want to tell anybody because he didn't want to share that. He didn't want people to know that he had cancer issues, that he was a cancer survivor, somebody that went through this horrible disease. And I don't know, I don't know what Roman's reasoning was that he didn't want to share it, but the negative feedback from the crowd, this venomous anti-Roman hate that he got back in 15, 16, 17, even last year, when people were they just boo him and boo him and boo him, and all this anti-Roman stuff. It's like he has to, in a weird way, I think Roman not necessarily enjoyed the backlash, but he appreciated maybe disappearing into his role, into that Roman Reigns character, and being this character that people reacted to. I think in many ways he enjoyed that, and he became like a focal point, somebody that was like, oh, at least I can play this Roman Reigns character, this this completely hated character, and he doesn't have to think about being the cancer guy in real life. I don't know. I'm just I'm taking a guess here, but it is kind of strange that all those years that people booed him and completely disliked him, and hated him, and called him names, and Roman retire, and we don't want to see Roman anymore, and all that really vicious stuff from the fans. It's interesting that he had to shoulder that burden of being a cancer guy by himself, and nobody knew. So you just never know. You just never know what people are going through. You know what I mean? All these different wrestlers and people that you meet in real life, you don't know what they're going through personally, whether it's health issues or psychological issues, etc. What kind of past problems they had to deal with in the past whether it's abuse or what have you. So you just never know with people, especially if they keep it a secret and it's just unknown. So, and to be fair to the fans too, I think the fans dislike the character, not so much the real life individual. You know, outside of wrestling, I mean, Roman seems like a cool dude, but like, it's the way that the Roman Reigns character, was booked by Vince McMahon, the way that he was booked as this unstoppable, invincible Superman, Cena 2.0. So you can't exactly blame the fans for disliking that and booing him. I think they're very much entitled to do it. Although I didn't like the corny lines, but I always kind of dug Roman Reigns. I never like fully hated him per se. I just thought that he was like, oh man, they're ruining his character. But like, I always kind of liked him as this cool looking, Shield member. I always thought he was just a cool looking character. He looked like a main eventer. He was a heavyweight. He had some cool moves, and I was like, yeah, I can dig Roman. I don't dislike him. I still want to see him perform. It's just that, make him a little bit more edgy. The same way with John Cena. These guys that could have, they could be a lot bigger. I think that's the problem, is that they have so much more potential to be bigger stars, and they could be doing so much more and be involved in better angles and better storylines, but because WWE is so kiddified and PG, and they just book it a certain way, and it's so sanitized and so corny, and very uninteresting, uninspired booking, it just becomes like this generic TV show with like interchangeable characters, and they don't really have huge stars. I mean, I know they try to make Roman into a big star, but he's not really that big. Maybe he's a lot more recognizable now because he's been around for years now as a main eventer. But even like in 15, 16, 17, when they try to make him into like the top guy, he never felt like a Hulk Hogan. He was such a far cry from those like crossover mainstream stars like The Rock in his prime in the late 90s, early 2000s, guys like Stone Cold. And of course, Hogan, and even somebody like a Randy Savage, or even like an Ultimate Warrior, and of course in WCW, guys like Sting and Goldberg, these guys they felt like a big deal. They felt like big stars. With Roman, he just seemed to be like what they had at the moment. This is the WWE's like biggest guy right now, or he's the most important guy right now. But he never felt like a big mainstream star. He never felt like a huge crossover star. Kind of like how Becky Lynch is now. Becky Lynch she's getting a big push, certainly, and she feels like a bigger star than the other people on the roster. But it's like she's only big within the small pond of WWE. And I say small pond in the sense that not a lot of people watch wrestling anymore. Not as much as the late 90s or the late 1980s, or during the heyday of the golden era, the golden age of WWF, and the Attitude Era and Monday Night Wars of the late 90s with WCW and WWF back in the day. So there's no huge crossover stars anymore that feel larger than life and so incredibly like big personas that can draw in so many millions and millions of people. I do think that Roman is a draw. He does sell merchandise and he is a cool looking character. It's just that he never felt like the biggest thing in wrestling. That was never the case. They try to make him into the biggest thing in wrestling, but he was the way that he's booked. He never felt like a huge big deal. Only in the eyes, I think, of Vince McMahon. And they could have done so much more things with him. He could have been way bigger than he is now. And it's cool to see him do movies with The Rock and stuff like that. I think the new Fast and the Furious spin-off that they have coming out, I think, what is it, Hobbs and Shaw, whatever it's called. That's cool. I think that's cool. I mean, I think it's great to see him in other forms of media and almost follow that Rock, Batista, John Cena route of maybe getting into a little bit of acting and all that. I'd like to see him in like I would have loved to see him as Conan the Barbarian or some other like barbarian type of role, like a Game of Thrones kind of thing. I could totally see him in Game of Thrones as like a new version of like a Khal Drogo type. that would have been cool, like a member of the Dothraki, the Dothraki race that's like a barbarian race or whatever. So, is Roman Reigns an all-time great? I think he's easily one of the best pushed, or one of the top pushed wrestlers and stars of the 2010s for sure. He might be number one. Maybe even more than Cena, maybe even more than CM Punk in this decade. Like when you think of the 2010s decade, it's Roman Reigns' decade for sure. I mean, from 14, 15, 16, 17, and in 2018. And you can even argue, even to this day, that he's still considered their top guy or whatever, number one or number two in the company. And certainly when he comes back, I'm sure he's going to be in the top position as well. But so you can argue, well, he definitely by the mid-late 2010s that he was their number one guy. But is he? Does that make him by default the number one wrestler of the 2010s? You can argue. I don't know if he was the biggest draw. I don't know if he was the actual real biggest star, because I think other people will try to argue like in-ring talent, maybe in-ring wise and how many great matches he's had. Maybe he doesn't compete with guys like I don't know, Okada and Omega from New Japan, Kazuchika Okada and Kenny Omega, when they were having those, so-called 6-star matches and 7-star matches in NJPW. But that's a very different product. That's more for a smaller work rate, strong style kind of audience, the more nerdier, non-casual fans. That's definitely more for a more like super into wrestling, super into the moves and technical work rate type of fans in wrestling, like Bullet Club type fans. So you can make an argument for, Okada would probably be the number one most pushed wrestler of New Japan this decade for sure. Either him or Kenny Omega, maybe even somebody like an AJ Styles or Tanahashi, but those guys would be in the top 4 for sure, and maybe Naito would be in the top 5. But so those guys would be the New Japan like best that they have. But then when it comes to WWE, the biggest company, Roman. Roman would be up there. The thing too with Roman is he was never the champion for very long. Every time he'd become a WWE champion or Universal champion, he wouldn't hold the belt for very long. That's the interesting part, is that they position him as one of the strongest book wrestlers as far as winning matches and main eventing Mania, and even having a win over The Undertaker at Mania. It's like he never held a title for very long. He was never like champion for like a whole year and a half. He never had these lengthy dominant reigns, like no pun intended. He never had these dominant title runs. Like that's interesting too, is that he would be positioned in a very high spot, but he was never champion for very long. Guys like AJ Styles would become champion longer. I think like Nikki Bella had a longer reign with the Divas title. You know what I mean? It's like the way that he would win championships. It's almost as short as maybe not quite as short, but almost as short as Sasha Banks. And Sasha Banks would win the Raw Women's title, and then she'd drop it like 2 weeks later. And Roman Reigns is kind of a similar thing. He'd hold the title for like a couple of months, drop it, hold it for a month and a half, he'd drop it, And it's not necessarily, sometimes it's not his fault, the whole, last year, dropping the Universal title, that's not his fault. That was his health issues that popped in. But the other times it's like pure booking. They give him the title and then they take it back, and then they keep trying to make him into a star by giving him the title, but it's like it always feels like they're trying to make him, but it's not fully working. You know what I mean? They never gave him that year-long, completely dominant title run. Brock Lesnar held the title longer than him. I would even say like Kevin Owens held the title longer than him. AJ, like I mentioned before, maybe even like Jinder Mahal. I would bet that Jinder Mahal held the WWE title longer than Roman Reigns. By far. I think he held it for like 6 months with Jinder. I think with Roman, in total, I don't think Roman held it for that long, including the Universal title. So I think that's also a part of it. It's evident that he was never able to have that longevity. He was never able to continuously dominate as the champion, which is really interesting. So does that make him an all-time great? I mean, in some ways he's almost like the opposite of Bruno Sammartino, or the opposite of like a Hulk Hogan, where those guys had long dominant runs. Hogan was champion in the 80s for like 4 years. Bruno was the champion between 60s and early mid 70s for like 8 years. 8 or 11 years or whatever it's called. However you want to add up both of his reigns. So he never had that lengthy reign either. You know what I mean? Like even somebody like a Bret Hart. Bret Hart was the longest reigning WWE champion technically of the 1990s decade. You know what I'm saying? 80s was 70s was Bruno, 80s was Hogan, 90s was Bret Hart. Although Kevin Nash did have the longest single run, the continuous run in the mid 90s, but Bret Hart in total had the longest WWE title reigns. And then in the 2000s, I don't know who held it the longest in the 2000s. Maybe Triple H. Or no, maybe it was John Cena in the 2000s. Yeah, it was probably John Cena. And then in this decade, I can't even. Maybe Brock Lesnar or CM Punk. I know with CM Punk he held the title for over 400 days, the WWE title, and then with Brock Lesnar, I think he's easily the longest reigning Universal Champion. So. Roman Reigns isn't even anywhere near those guys' reigns. So, how would he? Why would he be considered one of the greatest of all time if he wasn't even the champion for the longest time in this decade? Even though he was positioned as the top guy, so that's another huge strike against him. So, do I think that he's one of the greatest of all time? I think he's definitely Hall of Fame worthy. One day he's going to be in the Hall of Fame, no doubt. Because he's already been positioned as one of the top guys. But the problem is that he never had that lengthy, crowd unifying, everybody was behind him, everybody's cheering him, and everybody's buying his t-shirt type of fan base. He felt like he was a manufactured, character that Vince McMahon happened to like because he had a good look and he was a good worker. And that was it. He was just positioned as the top guy, but he was never that lengthy, incredible champion that everybody could get behind, that was like unifying. I would say Daniel Bryan was more popular than him. CM Punk was certainly more popular than him. Those guys were more over than Roman Reigns. You have the whole arena chanting for Daniel Bryan. You have the whole arena chanting for CM Punk. But with Roman, it's only certain times that he would get chanted. Only a few times where he would get a unifying chant, and only in certain times that would, whether he was announcing his remission or whether he was, back in 2014 when they were chanting Roman because they didn't want Batista to win at the Royal Rumble, certain times like that. But for the rest of it, it's like booing, booing, booing. The crowd is very anti-Roman for a long time. And so I think that's a huge strike against him, that he was never able to fully get over as a convincing, crowd unifying, where everybody loved him and everybody was into him when they were 100% behind him. He was nowhere near The Rock's level, nowhere near Stone Cold's level. So would I rank him as one of the greatest of all time? I can't. I don't think Roman is an all-time great. I do think he's a Hall of Famer, for sure. But I think he's more like, I don't want to call him a mid-card champion, but he feels more like because he's definitely got main event potential, but he's more like a forced champion. He was forced in there, almost like because I think Sid Vicious had more charisma than him, but he was almost like booked like a Sid Vicious. Sid Vicious was never the champion for very long in the 90s, but he would have the championship every now and then. He was a big guy with a good look, and but I think that Sid had more charisma than Roman for sure. But Sid was kind of booked in that like temporary. He could be the temporary big guy champion every now and then. He'd be the top guy, but he was never. He never had a dominant run, And so I would say that Roman Reigns in some ways was the modern day Sid or the modern day Lex Luger. It's really kind of interesting how he's kind of the top guy, but he's not. It's weird. It's a weird time in wrestling. So anyway, that's my opinion with Roman Reigns. I don't think he's an all-time great, but I do think he is definitely a Hall of Famer worthy, first ballot Hall of Famer wrestler. One day he's going to be in the Hall of Fame and people are going to appreciate his work especially in the Shield, but he's not necessarily an all-time one of the greatest wrestlers ever. I mean, I would rank Austin above him. The Rock is above him. Bret Hart was above him. Shawn Michaels is above him. Taker is above him. Brock Lesnar, I think, is above him. Even guys like CM Punk is above him. You know, guys like John Cena is probably above him. You know, of course, Bruno and Hogan and Randy and those guys and Ric Flair, those guys are above him too. You know, and between somebody like, let's say, Ultimate Warrior and Roman Reigns, I go with Ultimate Warrior. At least Ultimate Warrior had that charismatic, interesting gimmick, and his promos were unique for the time. You know, that cartoonish character. You know, that unpredictable, just wild, crazy promos. You know, unhinged, I guess. So at least he had that gimmick that worked for him, and he got the face paint. He was very marketable and all that. But with Roman is more like a reliable champion that they could slot in there every once in a while as a main eventer. But he's not a dominant, like, long running champion. He's not somebody that you throw everything at him and make him into like the biggest star in the company, but you know, make him the dominant champion. I just don't think he ever really reached that level, and I don't think he ever will be. So that's it for this episode of the Review Space. Thank you guys for watching. Subscribe to the channel. Check out the rest of the channel for more videos. And also, watch out for my upcoming video, because I do want to talk about, speaking of the 2010s, I want to talk about who is the biggest superstar of the 2010s decade. Who is the best wrestler of the 2010s. That's going to be an upcoming video for sure. So, until next time, peace.